Chapter 1. The Quiet Murmur of Rome, 1480. In the late 15th century, Rome was not the marble dream we imagine today. It was a city of dust, incense, and suspicion. A city where prayers mixed with whispers, and every church shadow might hide a secret. And into that world, under the pale golden Italian sunrise, a little girl was born. Her name was Lucrezia Borgia. She was the daughter of a man who would one day become pope, Rodrigo Borgia, a man of charm, ambition, and unshakable appetite for power. Her mother, Venanza de Catania, was not his wife. Few women in Rodrigo's life were. But even in her cradle, Lucrezia was marked by destiny. She would live between the glitter of the Vatican and the poison of politics, between faith and corruption, between the candlelight of devotion and the darkness of betrayal. Still, at the beginning it was all so quiet. The air of Rome carried the smell of orange blossoms. The bells rang lazily across the Tiber, and no one could yet imagine that this soft, golden-haired child would one day become the symbol of the Borgia legend. The beautiful poison, the Pope's daughter, the whispered name in every court of Europe. Chapter 2. The House of Borgia. The Borgias were not Roman. They were from Valencia, Spain, and that alone made them suspicious in the eyes of many Italian nobles. They were outsiders, ambitious, clever, and determined to rise above everyone else. Rodrigo Borgia, Lucrezia's father, was a man of contradiction. He could quote the scriptures perfectly, and yet he would plot behind a confessional screen without blinking. He could smile like a saint, but his mind moved like a serpent, slow, deliberate, calculating. When he became Pope Alexander VI in 1492, the city of Rome trembled. Some feared him, others adored him. All knew he would change the church forever. And at his side, not officially, but in spirit, were his children, Cesare Borgia, the dark and brilliant son, Juan Borgia, the reckless one, and Lucrezia, the beautiful daughter whose smile could silence a room. In Rome, people whispered that the Borgias drank from poisoned cups, both literally and metaphorically. But in truth, poison was only one of their tools. Their real power was charm. Lucrezia learned that power early. At 12 years old, she was already being considered for marriage alliances. Not for love. Love was for poets, but for politics. Each proposal was a chess move, each alliance a step toward control. And behind it all, her father watched through the calm eyes of a man arranging pieces on a board that stretched across Europe. Chapter 3. The First Marriage. When Lucrezia was 13, her father arranged her marriage to Giovanni Sforza, a nobleman from one of the most powerful families in Italy. The wedding was a spectacle of gold and lace. The papal palace glittered. Musicians played until dawn, and the streets of Rome were filled with torches and laughter. But beneath the celebration, there was calculation. The Sforzas were useful. For now, the marriage was not about affection, but alliance. And as always, alliances could shift like sand. Lucrezia smiled through it all, her eyes calm and distant. She was young, but already she understood that her family's survival depended on appearances. In the Borgia world, truth was a dangerous luxury. The union did not last. When politics changed, Rodrigo decided the Sforzas were no longer convenient. Whispers began, ugly, cruel whispers, that the marriage had never been consummated, that Lucrezia was still pure, that the Pope wanted to annul it. In the papal court, purity was not always holy. Sometimes it was strategy. The annulment came. Giovanni fled, and Lucrezia remained calm, quiet, and seemingly untouched. But behind her soft expression, she learned something vital. In Rome, even love could be rewritten like a papal decree. Chapter 4. The Poisoned Chalice. There are stories, perhaps only rumors, that the Borgias possessed a special goblet, a cup of gold and enamel, known as the Poisoned Chalice. A tool for diplomacy, one might say, a way to end conversations permanently. No one could ever prove it existed, but it became a symbol, whispered by those who feared the Borgias. When enemies vanished after dinners, people spoke of the chalice. When rivals grew pale and silent, they said, "The Pope's daughter smiled at them last night." Of course, History rarely tells us who truly mixed the powders or poured the wine, but Lucrezia's name, fair or not, became forever linked with poison. Yet, here is a quiet truth. Lucrezia may have been a pawn far more than a poisoner. Her father and brother made decisions. She lived with their consequences. Her letters, preserved in archives, speak not of hatred but of longing. She wrote of gardens, of books, of peace. Her handwriting was delicate, her tone kind. If she was guilty of anything, it was of surviving a world designed by men who believed beauty was a weapon. Chapter 5. The Second Marriage. To strengthen his power in the north, Pope Alexander arranged another marriage, this time to Alfonso of Aragon, a handsome young nobleman. For a while, it seemed real affection might have grown between them. They walked together in the papal gardens. They laughed in the sunlight. Rome began to believe that perhaps the Pope's daughter could be happy. But politics, as always, had no patience for happiness. Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brother, saw Alfonso as a threat to his ambitions. And one summer night, as the air hung heavy over the Vatican, assassins struck. Alfonso was stabbed, left bleeding on the steps of St. Peter's. He survived for a while. Lucrezia nursed him, wept for him, prayed for him. Then, one evening, when the guards looked away, someone entered his chamber. A pillow was pressed down. The prince's breath ended quietly. No proof ever tied the act to Cesare. But everyone knew, everyone, including Lucrezia. After that night, something in her changed. She became quieter. Her eyes grew deeper, as if she saw beyond the gold and marble of the Vatican to something darker. She began to understand that love, in her world, was just another form of danger. Chapter 6. The Duchess of Ferrara. When Lucrezia was 21, she was married for a third time to Alfonso d'Este, the Duke of Ferrara. This time, the alliance brought her something she had never truly known: distance from Rome. Ferrara was different. It was cultured, refined, filled with poets, scholars, and music. And there, away from her father's shadow, Lucrezia began to create her own world. She built libraries. She hosted artists. She wrote letters filled with philosophy and quiet sorrow. Some said she still used poison. Others said she used perfume instead, the subtle scent of civet and rose that lingered long after she left a room. But the truth is more ordinary and more human. Lucrezia Borgia, the woman painted as a demon in centuries of gossip, lived out her days as a patron of art and a mother of children. Her power faded with time. Her name, however, did not. When she died in 1519, at 39 years old, the bells of Ferrara rang low and long. And somewhere in Rome, perhaps Sumio, Annie whispered her name once more, not in hatred, but in memory. They say the past sleeps beneath the stones of old cities. In Rome, beneath the basilicas and marble steps, the Borgias still whisper. Their secrets turn to dust. Their legends grow softer with time. And somewhere, in the candlelit silence of history, a golden-haired woman smiles and places a cup down untouched. ZZZ Part 2, Shadows of Power Chapter 7, The Fall of Rome's Golden House. By the time Lucrezia settled in Ferrara, Rome was already beginning to murmur again. The Borgia sun was setting, slowly but surely. Her father, Pope Alexander VI, still held power, but age was creeping up on him. The feasts were fewer. The laughter in the papal halls turned hollow, and the faces that once smiled now watched him with patient calculation. Power in Rome was never owned. It was borrowed, until someone else took it. Cesare Borgia, her brother, once called the Dark Prince, was fighting wars across Italy. He wore black armor and carried banners marked with a bull, the Borgia crest. Cities fell before him: Imola, Forli, Faenza, each one swallowed by his ambition. But with every conquest came a new enemy. The nobles of Italy, the Sforza, the Orsini, the Colonna, waited for the moment the Borgias would stumble. They didn't have to wait long. In the summer of 1503, During a banquet at the Vatican, Pope Alexander fell ill. So did Cesare. Some whispered that the food had been poisoned. Others whispered that the poison had been meant for someone else. It is said the Pope's skin turned pale, his lips blue. He gasped for breath in the night, and by morning Rome had lost its shepherd. Alexander VI was dead. The most feared and powerful pope of the Renaissance lay still on a marble slab, and beside him, his son Cesare struggled to rise, his body trembling from fever. The empire of the Borgias, built on charm, cunning, and blood, began to crumble like ash. Chapter 8. The Lonely Brother. Cesare recovered, but his world did not. Without his father, he was a soldier without a shield. The new Pope Julius, too, hated the Borgias. He moved swiftly to erase them from power. Their titles were stripped. Their lands were seized. Their name became a curse again, spoken only in whispers. Cesare fled across Italy, chased by his enemies. Lucrezia, in Ferrara, heard only fragments of news, letters delayed, rumors half true. She sat in her quiet chamber, listening to the sound of rain against the window, wondering if her brother still lived. He had been cruel, yes, but also the only one who ever truly understood her. They were bound not by affection, but by survival. In 1507, word reached her Cesare Borgia had died in battle in Navarre, struck down by a spear. He was 31. They buried him in an unmarked grave. No banners, no songs, no prayers. Just a name fading into the soil. And in Ferrara, Lucrezia bowed her head, and for a long while she said nothing. Chapter 9. The Duchess Alone. Life in Ferrara moved more slowly after that. Lucrezia became quieter, almost spectral. She walked to the palace gardens at dusk, her dress brushing against rosemary and ivy. The courtiers of Ferrara respected her, but they also feared her. The Borgia name still carried its shadow. Even when she smiled, they wondered what secrets are behind her calm gaze. But the Duchess had changed. She had grown weary of masks and whispers. Her letters to friends became filled with gentleness and melancholy. She wrote of her children, of poetry, of the way light fell across the palace floor in the late afternoon. She wrote of faith, of forgiveness. And sometimes she wrote of Rome, but always as if it were a dream she once had, now fading at the edges. In her heart, she knew that the world had already begun to rewrite her story. She was becoming a legend, not the woman she truly was, but the figure people wanted her to be. Chapter 10. The Myths of Beauty and Sin. For centuries, the name Lucrezia Borgia would echo in plays, poems, and gossip. Painters would show her holding a cup, the poisoned chalice. Poets would call her a seductress, a witch, a devil wrapped in silk. But most of those stories came after her death. The truth was quieter. She was intelligent, diplomatic, and careful, more a survivor than a sinner. Still, in a world ruled by men, a beautiful woman with influence was never innocent in the eyes of history. The myth of Lucrezia grew because people needed it. They needed villains and saints, angels and poisoners. And Lucrezia, graceful, mysterious, forever between good and evil, fit the part perfectly. Perhaps that is why her image endures. Not because she was monstrous, but because she was human. And humanity, in its quietest form, frightens us most of all. Chapter 11. The Letters. In the archives of Ferrara, her letters still exist. The ink is faded, the paper fragile as autumn leaves. They are not the writings of a temptress, but of a woman weary of being misunderstood. She writes to poets, to nuns, to her husband, to her children. She speaks of illness, of faith, of dreams. She prays for peace, not political peace, but the kind that lives within the soul. There is one letter, written not long before her death, where she writes, "I have loved and I have lost. I have been praised and accused. Yet I am only what God made me and what the world allowed me to become." There is no poison in that letter, only exhaustion and grace. Chapter 12. The End of the Name. Lucrezia Borgia died in 1519. Some say it was after childbirth. Others say illness took her slowly. The Duke of Ferrara, her husband, mourned her sincerely. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini, a quiet place with white walls and soft light. Her tomb bears no grand inscription, just her name. In the centuries that followed, the Borgia legend grew larger than the truth. Painters painted her face. Writers turned her into a ghost of beauty and sin. But under the stone floor of a small Italian convent, the real Lucrezia sleeps. Peaceful, silent, forgotten by the noise of history. If you ever visit Ferrara and walk through the old streets at dusk, you might hear the faint echo of a bell, and for a moment, if you listen closely, you might feel as if the centuries pause, and the Pope's daughter, far from Rome, is still walking, through her garden, a cup of wine in her hand, untouched. The story of Lucrezia Borgia is not a tale of poison or lust. It is a story of survival, of a woman born into danger, who learned to smile through every rumor, and who, in the quiet end, found peace in the one place the world could not reach, her own silence. ZZZ Part 3, The Quiet Years of Ferrara Chapter 13, The City of Water and Stone. Ferrara in the early 16th century was a city of calm elegance. It did not roar like Rome or glitter like Florence. It breathed. Its narrow streets wound between pale brick walls. Rivers whispered beneath bridges of stone. And from the high towers, bells marked the slow rhythm of passing days. Lucrezia walked those streets often, her steps soft against the worn cobblestones. People bowed as she passed, politely, respectfully, yet always with a hint of curiosity. To them, she was both duchess and mystery, a woman whose name carried 1,000 rumors, and yet whose presence felt oddly serene. She smiled at children, spoke kindly to market women, and in the evenings, she retreated to her private library, where candlelight touched the spines of books written in Latin, French, and Italian. It was in those quiet hours that she found peace, or something like it. The past still followed her, but in Ferrara, it spoke in softer tones. Chapter 14, The Mirror of Faith. As the years passed, Lucrezia turned increasingly toward faith, not the grand faith of cathedrals and papal power, but the gentle, private faith of a woman seeking forgiveness for things she could never fully name. She visited convents, spoke with nuns, and gave gifts to the poor. Her prayers were long and quiet, and sometimes her tears stained the pages of her prayer books. Yet her devotion was not despair. It was reflection, the slow acceptance that her life, like every life, was a tapestry woven from both virtue and sin. Sometimes, in her chapel, she would light a single candle and whisper names. Her father, Rodrigo, her brother, Cesare, the husband who was murdered, the husband who survived, and the children who might never understand the world she came from. Each flame was a memory, each flicker a forgiveness she hoped God would accept. Chapter 15, The Children of the Duchess. Lucrezia bore several children in Ferrara. They grew up among gardens and tutors, learning Latin music and the proper ways to walk through court without making noise. She loved them fiercely, but there was always distance. The quiet, careful distance of someone who had learned too well how easily love can be used against you. To her eldest son, Ercole, she gave advice written in letters. Be just, my son, for justice is the only crown that does not tarnish. To her daughters, she wrote about kindness, about how beauty fades, but gentleness endures longer than marble. Her children knew their mother was wise, but they also knew she sometimes stared out the window for hours, as if listening for voices only she could hear. Chapter 16, Letters to the Past. The older Lucrezia became, the more she wrote. Letters, diaries, notes to poets, and quiet reflections. Her handwriting grew smaller, more fragile, as if she was trying to use less of herself with every page. In one letter, she wrote, "The past is not dead, but sleeping. It wakes sometimes, and when it does, I feel its breath behind me." There was no bitterness in those words, only fatigue. History had already begun to twist her story into legend, but Lucrezia herself had grown tired of defending it. She no longer sought to be understood. She only wanted peace, and perhaps to be forgotten kindly. Chapter 17. The Music of Ferrara. In the court of Ferrara, music was sacred. Composers came from Venice, Florence, and even from France. Lutes played softly in the courtyards, and voices rose in slow, mournful hymns that seemed to float in the evening air. Lucrezia loved those sounds. She often sat behind a curtain, listening quietly, unseen. Sometimes she would hum, very faintly, to herself. The music reminded her of everything she had lost, the laughter of her youth, the warmth of her brother's ambition before it turned to cruelty, the scent of orange blossoms in the Roman air. And yet she did not grieve anymore. Grief had softened into something gentler, a kind of calm nostalgia that neither hurt nor healed, but simply existed. When the musicians finished, she would thank them softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. And as they bowed, they would glance at her, the Duchess with the quiet eyes, and wonder what she remembered that they would never know. Chapter 18. The Garden at Twilight. In her final years, Lucrezia spent more time in the garden than in the court. She planted herbs, roses, and lilies. She walked beneath the olive trees in the fading light, her steps measured, her thoughts slow. The servants said she spoke to flowers. Maybe she did. Maybe she was simply speaking to the ghosts of her own memory. Sometimes at dusk, she would stop by a small fountain and watch the water ripple. The reflection that looked back at her was gentle but lined with time. The golden hair had faded. The smile was still there, quieter but real. She once said to her confessor, "If the world remembers me as wicked, then let it. The world has always needed its villains. I am tired of correcting it." And in that single sentence, perhaps, she freed herself from the burden of her name. The Duchess of Ferrara no longer sought power, no longer sought redemption. She simply lived, quietly, thoughtfully, until life itself became lighter than breath. ZZZ Part 4. Echoes After Candlelight, Chapter 19. The Slow Fading of Days. By 1518, Ferrara had grown older with her. The streets that once rang with laughter now murmured with memory. The palace halls were cool and dim, perfumed with cedar and wax. Lucrezia moved through them like a shadow of herself, calm, graceful, slower than before. Her health was failing. Each winter stayed a little longer, and each spring took more effort to reach. Yet she did not complain. In letters to friends, she wrote about weather, books, and her children's progress. She spoke of her garden and the color of the sky after rain. Nothing dramatic, just life in its simplest, most ordinary moments. And perhaps that was her final victory, to turn a name once drenched in scandal into a whisper of ordinary peace. Chapter 20. The Last Letter. In June of 1519, Lucrezia fell ill after childbirth. For days she drifted between sleep and waking, her mind half in this world, half in the next. She asked for paper and ink. Her hand trembled as she wrote what would be her final letter, a simple note to her husband. "My lord, do not grieve too much. The Lord calls each of us in his time. I have been blessed beyond measure to have peace in my last years. Pray for me and remember me kindly." She signed it, Lucrezia Borgia. No mention of Borgia, no need. That name belonged to the past. A few days later, as the bells of Corpus Domini convent rang for vespers, Lucrezia Borgia took her final breath. She was 39. Her hand rested on a rosary. Her lips moved in a prayer no one could hear. And when the candle beside her bed flickered out, the room fell into the deep, still silence of release. Chapter 21. The Tomb and the Silence. They buried her in a convent she had often visited, beneath a plain stone slab. No gold, no Latin praise, no statues. Only a name and a date. The nuns sang softly, their voices rising like mist. Outside, the air was warm and still. Ferrara returned to its quiet rhythm. The Duke mourned her genuinely, not as a Borgia, but as a wife. Her children grew, married, and faded into the long family line of the Este dynasty. And Lucrezia herself, the real woman, the one who read poetry and tended roses, slipped gently into oblivion. But history does not forget so easily. It likes its ghosts too much. Chapter 22. The Legend Awakens. Decades after her death, the story of Lucrezia Borgia began to change. Writers in Rome, Florence, and Paris whispered her as a femme fatale, a woman of silken sins and poisoned beauty. They spoke of secret banquets, of golden cups laced with venom, of brothers and lovers entangled in dark deeds. Painters imagined her with emerald eyes and a smile that killed. Playwrights turned her into a symbol of temptation. And so, the myth grew, a story that bore her name, but not her truth. Centuries later, some historians would try to restore her image, a clever woman trapped in a world of men, a victim of politics and power. But even they could not fully erase the poison that fiction had poured into her cup. Perhaps that is how it must be. History is rarely fair. It remembers what entertains, not what is true. Still, in the soft shadow of that Ferrara convent, beneath a simple stone, the real Lucrezia Borgia rests. Qui, forgiven and finally at peace. If you listen closely, past the rumors and the poems, you might hear the truth breathe beneath the dust. A young girl who wanted to be loved, a daughter who lived in a pope's shadow, a woman who found grace in a world that never understood her, and somewhere, perhaps only in dream, a golden chalice sits on a table, empty, untouched, catching the last light of the sun. ZZZ Part 5. The Eternal Whisper Chapter 23. The Artist Lucrezia. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The papal palaces changed their banners, their popes, their secrets. But Lucrezia remained, not as a woman, but as a painted face, a name that lived between candlelight and imagination. In the 19th century, painters like Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Frank Cadogan Cooper dreamed her into color again. They painted her with hair like sunlight caught in gold thread, eyes deep with untold stories, lips curved in something between sorrow and serenity. In each painting, she was different, sometimes an angel, sometimes a temptress, sometimes both in the same breath. No one could agree on who she truly was. And perhaps that was her final trick, to belong to every dream, yet to none of them fully. For the artist, she was the eternal muse, the embodiment of beauty wrapped around mystery. For the poets, she was a symbol of corruption and grace intertwined. And for the sleepless listener like you, she became a voice from another century. Softer now, slower, like the hum of time itself. Chapter 24. The Historian's Puzzle. Modern scholars would later reopen her letters, dust off the pages that had slept for hundreds of years. They found tenderness in her handwriting, kindness in her thoughts, grace in her diplomacy, no trace of poison, no confession of crime, only the quiet patience of a woman navigating a world built to misunderstand her. And so the question remains, was she truly what the world said she was? A deceiver? A killer? Or simply a woman trying to survive in an empire of men who never let her speak freely? History offers no answer. It never does. It only offers fragments, letters, portraits, rumors, pieces of a life scattered across time. The rest must be imagined. And imagination, like rumor, has a habit of being louder than truth. Chapter 25. The Whisper That Remains. If you walk today through Ferrara, the convent still stands. Its walls are pale and cool. Its garden smells faintly of rosemary and old stone. Inside, near a small altar, there is a slab of marble. It bears a simple inscription. Lucrezia Borgia. Tourists pass by quietly. They take photographs, then leave. The silence remains. Sometimes the afternoon light falls through the window, illuminating the stone just for a moment. And in that light, it almost feels as though time itself is bowing to a woman who was both victim and victor, both history and myth. Because in the end, the truth about Lucrezia Borgia is not written in books or painted on canvas. It lives somewhere else, in the soft breath between stories, in the quiet pulse of memory that refuses to fade. She is the sound of a turning page, the echo of a prayer half remembered, the shimmer of gold dust on a forgotten chalice. And maybe, just maybe, if you close your eyes now and listen to the stillness behind the words, you can almost hear her voice. Not as a sinner, not as a saint, but as a woman saying gently, I was never what they say. Idea I was only what life required me to be. And so the candle burns lower, the air softens, history exhales, the Pope's daughter sleeps again, and the poisoned chalice rests, empty, harmless, gleaming faintly in the dark,